instant quotations. We try and have a more long-term strategic reflection. So we thought a week is a good period to allow to go by before we host this kind of webinar. So welcome to as people are joining us on YouTube, and those who have registered and joined us on the webinar, you're most welcome. I'll first ask Mashete to give us his input, and then I'll introduce you to the rest of the panel, who'll then give some responses, and then we'll put it open for a bit of Q&A, and the panel would be allowed to respond to that, and then Mashete will come in as and when required. Mashete, as colleagues would know, is the senior researcher political economy at the Mapungubwe Institute. He's held several positions in the public financial kind of nexus, so I think many of you would know him from that period. Over to you, Mashete.
Okay. Is the screen shown? Thanks. Thanks, Abba.
We can see you.
Thank you very much, Abba. Good morning, colleagues, and thank you very much for joining the Mistra's share of the MTBPS review. So I'm going to do a short, review of the MTBPS. So many people have called it so many names. I would like to go with the adjustment paralysis, and I'll explain why. I think we are heading into that territory where we really are no longer dealing with the budget, but at most, some kind of persistent adjustments which are causing, which are paralyzing the budgets of many spending agencies. So, yeah, just as a background, I think, as Abba has mentioned, the MTBS has captured the imagination of the country, and going into the MTBS, many people have called it, the pre and post analysis have actually described it as the most difficult MTBPS. But when you actually look back to all the previous MTBS and budget, you actually get a sense that this has been the overriding theme about, the budget is becoming increasingly more and more difficult. This difficultness, I suppose, it's invoking high level of public interest and expectations in the budget, because as Africans, we are looking for some kind of a sovereign remedy, some kind of a magic bullet, to deal with the confluence of socio-economic and fiscal governance challenges that the country is actually experiencing. But at the same time, I think it's very important to keep in mind that the MTBPS itself has got limitations to the extent to which it can address some of those concerns that South Africans have. And the main, I think, is just to remind ourselves that MTBPS is really about adjusting your fiscal targets, your spending and revenue targets based on your spending patterns, also the economic performance, but also looking forward to review your fiscal projections based on the economic outlook. I think that's the essence I would like just to keep as I go through the presentations, that it is merely an adjustment budget to deal with unforeseen circumstances. But the overriding message that is coming across, I think, from this MTBS is that budgets, fiscal targets are being persistently unrealized. And these graphics essentially just indicate the deviation from the 2023 budget to where we are today when the MTBS was presented. So the non-interest expenditure has been revised downwards by approximately 4 billion rand due to the revenue shortfall that everybody was speaking about. We've got a shortfall of 56 billion rand. And why we have got this shortfall, I think, for me, is that in the 2023 budget, the Finance Authority assumed some kind of a permanent revenue collection windfall. And as a result, they relaxed the stance on hard budget constraint. I mean, we've had some windfall in February. Instead of using that windfall to adjust or to correct the fiscal trajectory that was used in part to take over the Eskom debt, which I think is a loosening of that stance on hard budget constraint. The spending decline is not proportional to the revenue decline, obviously, because if you look at the baseline reduction, so the baseline reduction comprises of numerous other adjustments, which include underspending. There's also some drawdowns on the reserves. But essentially, the main budget balance increases by an amount equal to the shortfall, despite this expenditure adjustment. So essentially what this is saying is that, notwithstanding the fact that there's been some expenditure reductions, there is no necessarily, it does not affect the fiscal deficit, because in a way those expenditure reductions are not as hard or as strict as they should be. The second slide here is just to indicate that so we are seeing expenditure moderation. Some people call it fiscal consolidation, which is accompanied by persistent negative balance. So on the left side, so what the MTBS is doing for us is that it is maintaining the fiscal trajectory of previous budgets, notwithstanding the fact that the rate of real growth in expenditure is nearing negative. So in other words, the Treasury has assumed that have assumed that inflation is going to almost act as an automatic fiscal consolidation instrument. Because if you look at the graph on the left, the green line is not necessarily plateauing. It keeps on increasing, and I think that for me is some kind of the illusion of this fiscal consolidation and the optimistic revenue forecast, which are now easing South Africa into some kind of a non-discretionary deficit. We've got this deficit that is ongoing, that is persistent, because we are not willing to take hard decisions in controlling that blue line that I should the main expenditure. So you've got some kind of a, call it without, for lack of better word, in an unholy alliance of fiscal indicators. So we've got rising expenditure, you've got decline in revenue, but at the same time, we've got a larger fiscal gap growing in parallel with rising expenditure, albeit at a declining rate. So economists would usually say is that expenditure is still increasing, but it is increasing at a decreasing rate. On the left side is just to indicate that over time, I think that gap, if you look at the revenue as a percentage of GDP relative to expenditure as a relative to GDP, so that gap has remained consistently, almost the same over time since from 2008. We're all aware of this gap. And when you look at what the MTBS 2023 is doing, it's not necessarily narrowing that gap. So there's an assumption that over the medium-term expenditure framework from 2004, that gap is most likely to decline. But as you know, many of these projections don't always get realized. As I mentioned in the first slide, is that increasingly some of these fiscal targets are not being realized because perhaps we are too optimistic about the future. And as a result, I think we are now trading into that very dangerous territory where expenditure to GDP, the total debt to GDP, the gross debt to GDP, almost reaching 80%. Now, people always ask, what is the threshold for a country like South Africa? And there is no such a threshold. I think the issue here is whether the economy has got do we have that insufficient carrying capacity to sustain that type of deficit and that type of debt? And I think going forward, we don't necessarily, the country does not have that kind of a way without to deal with, higher debt to GDP that we are currently experiencing. And this is shown in the next slide. Yes. I tried to show this. Sorry. Yeah. So this is the next slide just shows the extent to which we are now slipping into that kind of a structural deficit, where on the one hand, you have got a debt service costs which are increasing, because of the high interest rate that we now have to pay. But at the same time, we've got the main budget balances, which is not getting any smaller. So the result is that now your gross borrowing requirement is also increasing, and it is increasing because now we have to pay back the debt. We are now even borrowing to finance the previous debt, which is a very difficult situation which a country really want to find itself in, where you have to borrow in order to finance your previous debt. And as we know, the debt service cost is the first charge against national revenue. So before we can even think about allocating resources to other, important functions, social functions, you have to take out the debt service cost. But at the same time, you must also borrow because you are dealing with a fiscal gap that is growing wide. And the result, of course, is that we are now have to borrow that 500 billion a year for a year, so that we can deal with the fiscal deficit, but at the same time repay back, deal with some of the debt redemptions that we are dealing with. And going forward, as the debt becomes even wider, the likely effect of that 500 billion becoming even 600, 700 billion is very high if that gap is not being narrowed down anytime soon. And on the right side, this graph actually indicates just we've had numerous opportunities to actually readjust our budget. As I've indicated in the first slide, that in the 2023 budget, we've had a significant revenue increase with windfall, but instead of using that to maybe flatten or reduce the deficit, we've expanded that, and as a result, we are now having to deal with the structural deficit. So essentially, we have missed a lot of windows opportunities to take really drastic decisions to address this widening gap between revenue and expenditure, and it is becoming really an untenable situation. Now, on the expenditure side, I think the adjustment that is happening there really, for me, resembles some kind of what I call the eye of the storm, the hurricane eye. And because South Africa is such a unique country, we tend to go north when other people are going south. Those who are familiar with the physics of the hurricane eye is that in the middle of the hurricane, it's a little bit more calmer than the outside. On the outside of the storm is very destructive, is very violent. But in our case, the outside of that storm is where you actually see the calmness, and the violence and destruction happens within in that very eye. And why I'm saying this is that the composition of expenditure, if you look at the proportional allocation per function over time, has remained relatively the same. So the amount of money that we allocate to certain functions as a proportion has not changed that much, and the MTPS continue on that very trend. So we're questioning social services against consolidation. The revenue shortfall exacerbate debt service cost proportional share. So, and we are also seeing permanent provisional allocation of SRD grant, which is tilting expenditure share. So, overall, there is that stability on the outside of the hurricane, but you've got some shifts which are caused by I would say maybe a lapse of budget control lapses, where you would see, especially in respect to the SRD grant, because a decision has not been taken as yet as to whether this social relief of distress grant is going to continue incessantly or is going to be terminated as a result. And as a result, decisions about whether to continue with this grant are taken almost abruptly every year, and that has got obviously implications on your proportional allocation per function over time. But what you're also witnessing is that there is stagnant, expenditure growth in some of the very important functions like your defense and police. And of course, this has got implication for the operations of those functions, especially if you consider the fact that compensation of employees account for about 70% and 80% of the budget of the defense and police, respectively. That leaves them with about 30% and 20% to deal with their to deal with operational budgets. And this is what I really, it's a manifestation of this, the calmness of the outside. So it's the facade that the budget is giving, is that from 2017, if you look at what happened from 2017, we've been spending about 15% of the total main allocation on education. The MTBS from in the 2023 budget, that has declined to 14% and remains at 14% to this day. So it gives a sense of stability that we are still maintaining that kind of a high expenditure on education, because the relative share has not changed over time. And it's the same with healthcare, although it has declined a little bit to about 11%. I think where the problem is in respect to the debt service cost, and that's where the crowding out effect actually become very highly pronounced from where it was in 2017. Our debt service cost was about 11%. Now we're sitting at 16%. Obviously, it means that we have taken money away from some of the critical functions, or we have not grown the expenditure of certain functions, especially your defense and security, defense and police. We have not grown that because with the little bit of other funds that is available are now going to be dealing with the debt service cost. The next slide. The next slide really is the adjustment process that happens, notwithstanding the fact that you've got this stability on the outside, this stability on the outside of the storm. What happens is inside the budget is actually where you've got a lot of machinations, you've got a lot of movements which are really causing a lot of instability in the budgets of most departments. For this year, so the MTBS is proposing some kind of an adjustment of about 20, an upward adjustment to the budget that was tabled in February of about 3.7 billion. But if you look at what has happened, is that there has been, because of the shifts in the budget line items of different functions or department, is that they've taken money away from certain programs, they've increased certain programs, and they've decreased certain programs. And as a result, you're sitting with an upward adjustment of about 29 billion for this year, and a downward adjustment of 26 billion. Although the net effect on the total non-expenditure allocation is 4 billion, but there's significant shifts within the sub-programs, and that creates a lot of instability and uncertainty with respect to budget implementation. So essentially, what this slide is trying to display is that aggregate functional expenditure shares, they really mask significant instability in sub-program, and this is partly as a result of budget planning lapses, and it causes unnecessary budget adjustment. And why I'm saying this is that if you look at with the current wage, the wage increase provision, that we could have anticipated already in February that there was just no way Treasury was going to win with this unilateral decision not to allocate money for wage increases, but they were left to, they continued with the budget in any way. So I think that is kind of for me, it's a budget planning lapse that should be addressed, because now you have to deal with this huge movement in the sub-program in order to address the problem that the Treasury wanted to deal with. And wage increase obviously account for a larger share of the upward adjustment. So essentially is that as the adjustments occurs, is that money is being moved from very important programs within some of these sub-programs to go and deal with wage increases. An example would be social development. There's no provision for wage increase in social development, and essentially that means that within their current allocation, they going to have to take money away from some of the programs to deal with wage increase. And where I think for me the important thing here is that the downward adjustments are imposed on some of the very important budget programs crucial for national development. So if you think of the National Student Financial Aid Scheme, you've got the Human Settlement Development Grant, which mainly is used to build RDP houses. We've got the Community Works Program that employs people who are people. We've got the Presidential Employment Initiative, again, Municipal Infrastructure Grant. So those are some of the programs which have actually experienced huge budget cuts, and for this particular in this MTBBS. An example would be, NSFAS is going down by about 2 billion. The SRD grant is projected to go down by it was reduced by 1 billion rand. The Human Settlement Development Grant was reduced by 1.6 billion. And the Municipal Infrastructure Grant was reduced by 2 billion. Now, this have got huge implications on what actually happens with budget implications. So at an MTBS level, because we need to balance the budget, we need to make sure that the budget is stable, it is more predictable. But at a sub-program level, we don't necessarily pay attention to those very principles about predictability of implementing program, and also ensuring that you actually reach the very objectives that you've set out with the allocations that was made in the 2023 budget. And this is an example of what I'm saying. If you look at the unintended consequences of unbridled expenditure adjustment, especially on the Human Settlement Development Grant. So if you look at the MTBS the 2023 budget has allocated 14.5 billion, give or take, to the Human Settlement Development Grant. But that has since been revised downwards, as I've mentioned, to about 12.5 billion rand or so. But if you take a historical, overview of what has actually happened to this particular grant, is that in 2011, the allocation was sitting at 14 billion. Now, in 2023, the allocation is sitting at a level below that it was in about 12 years ago. And yet, this is a very important program, crucial for some of our country's important development objectives. And we are currently sitting with a housing backlog of about 2 million houses. But we've got this, parochial focus on adjustment targets, which tends to undermine those very important development policy targets. And this was also raised in the Auditor General report recently. And what they highlight, the Auditor General, what actually they highlight is that because of these shifts in the budgets, the in-year shifts in allocation, the departments are now becoming increasingly wary, and they don't even include some of the important spending or performance indicators in their performance, in the annual performance plans. So, for instance, they mentioned that 8 of the 10 auditees in public works, they did not include an indicator on government-owned land parcels released towards spatial transformation. And in the same vein, they found that the 10 auditees in human settlement did not include 4 indicators related to registration of title deed. That is the essence of what this, these shifts in sub-program budgets are causing. They are really, the implication is on service delivery, notwithstanding the fact that at an aggregate level, at a national level, we want to balance the budget. The MTBS wants to balance the budget, but we don't really think about the consequences of these shifts on budget. Now, the other thing I think which has been mentioned is that fiscal balance is lost. Much of this fiscal imbalance is lost in the compensation of employees, and compensation of employees sometimes is scapegoated as one of the reasons why we are now sitting with this huge revenue and expenditure gap, because we are now spending almost 700 billion or so of the budget on compensation of employees, and that constitute about 32% of consolidated spending, of consolidated national spending. But if you look at non-interest expenditure, if you use non-interest expenditure, that accounts for about 40%. So of course, it is very high when you compare to some of our peer countries. Some countries are at 10%, some countries are at 15%. So our compensation of employee as a percentage of the national budget, it's very high. But again, that is relative, and I suppose it's a discussion for another day. Now, the issue is what happens with this current MTBS. How do you deal with the compensation of employees? So the National Treasury has assumed have enforced some kind of a negative over time, have enforced some kind of a very slow growth moderation, which is now almost negative because they've been reducing spending on compensation of employees. But essentially, the problem here is that kind of strategy is not necessarily working, because the problem is not in the overall allocation itself. The problem is in the management of the compensation. And this is what the graph is actually indicating, is that over time, compensation of employee by budgets is actually converged. So there is convergence in the salary structure of government. If you look at what has happened to the unit cost of unit cost of compensation of employee from 2013 to 2023, now, specifically looking at this particular category where unit cost is between 0 to 350,000, it has declined drastically from about 998,000 people to 404,000 people, while the medium management has increased. So essentially, what is happening is that because of mismanagement of HR processes, where people you would use either performance awards or even progressions, even salary progressions, they end up in higher salary bands than they should be, and that is causing this kind of convergence. Now, just reducing the growth of expenditure of spending on SOE alone is not going to put a dent in what you really want to address, because the problem is in the HR management and not necessarily the overall budget itself. So there is just the message is that going forward, it is pointless to focus on what really MTBS is saying about the budget allocated to compensation for employees, but it's mainly what happens at the budget implementation level, at spending agency level, with respect to the management of HR, and the extent to which it affects or changes the wage structure within government. Now, where do you find this elusive fiscal balance? Because essentially the corrective path is really to make sure that over time your revenue and expenditure your expenditure is below your revenue expenditure, that the gap between your revenue and expenditure becomes even less. What is very clear is that the prospect for near-term revenue growth and drastic expenditure decline are very slim. In this particular MTBS, the minister announced municipal ESCOM debt relief, and there we are also hearing about the SOE buyout requests, which have not been factored in the current MTBS. So the projections which are currently being made about debt reduction or deficit reduction have not factored all of this in, and so the likely effect of that gap narrowing over time in the next 3 years is very limited. Obviously, we have been tinkering on the margins of the fiscal aggregates, and that tends to delay bold adjustment decisions, because the crisis that we often talk about, almost it looks like something in a distant future, and as a result, decisions are being delayed. The bold adjustment decisions are being delayed, instead of making sure that the expenditure, actually the line that expenditure line which I showed, start to plateau or go down. We have not done that because that crisis that everybody is talking about, it looks like in the distant future. Now, the rebalancing effort is not obviously the responsibility of the finance ministry, but all the spending agencies. And the Auditor General actually reflects most of the time annually on some of the causes of inefficient spending, which have not really received much attention. And that's where I think the fiscal balance is likely to come from. Now, so in the next slide, this is where we will try to indicate where this balance is likely to come from. And we don't necessarily have a very systematic way of measuring some of these things, so that you can link, your budget cuts to the inefficiency of the spending agencies. Now, one of the things is cost overruns. We've got poor workmanship, we've got poor project commissioning, we've got interest paid on late payments, overpricing, all of those. We don't necessarily know how much of money are we losing through all these inefficient expenditure practices. And unless we find a way through which we can systematize collection of data on this particular, then we'll be able to know how much are we likely to save or reduce the revenue and expenditure gap over time if we deal with some of this. And of course, the elephant in the room is the SOE bailouts. We've heard now Transnet has asked for 40 billion or so from the ministry. We also heard SABC was asking for 1.5 billion or so. The minister is taking a tough stance, but I think they're bluffing. They're most probably going to provide the bailouts. So all of these things have got obviously an effect on the revenue and the expenditure gap going forward. And unless we really systematize, we find a way through which we collect information on this particular and know how much exactly are we losing through, how much is the entire fiscus losing through these inefficient expenditure practices, then we would not be able to deal with that gap going forward. Now, in conclusion, is that the window of opportunity to avert the fiscal crisis is fast closing. My own prediction is that if we get to 100% gross debt to GDP, because now we are sitting at 80%, the likely effect is that we are going to have to borrow almost 1 trillion rand a year in order to deal with either the deficit and also some of the redemptions. And we don't really want to be in that kind of a situation, I think. So, and by the look of things, when you look at the current trajectory, is that we are likely to hit that level if nothing changes, if there's no improvement in GDP growth, if there is no drastic cut in expenditure, we are likely to hit that 100% debt to GDP in about 6 years. So that's where I suppose we really will really be dealing with the problem. So that window of opportunity to avert the crisis that the likes of Argentina is going through is fast closing, and the right things have got to be done. And the right things are not, but they are not erosion of budget programs. It's like the way I've indicated with the Human Settlement Development Grant, it is not in reviewing the number of national departments, because that seems to be the overriding message coming from the presidency, that the review of these national departments, the number of national departments, is like it's magically going to cause some kind of reduction in expenditure. It is also not a cut of COE by stealth, which is what the Treasury is currently doing, or the strategy. Nor is it a rose-colored revenue and spending forecast, as we have seen now. With the forecasts are still fairly, optimistic, but I think they could go down, so that at least we know we deal with the reality that we are not going to have resources anytime soon, and therefore a serious spending decision have got to be spending cut decision have got to be taken. Now, the right decisions that have got to be taken, in my view, would be that, or the bold decisions would be, to change the economy and the revenue structure. Those are very, long term. They don't happen overnight. But those are the type of reforms that needs to start happening before we hit the crisis. The budget process and the we need reforms on budget process and implementation. I think increasingly now there are so many budget process and implementation lapses within the treasury and even within the spending agencies. Those have got to be addressed. And lastly, is the public services reforms, and mostly here is really about internalizing the hard budget constraints, because many of these spending agencies don't seem to realize that there is a fiscal crisis, because the overall expenditure at a nominal level keeps on increasing. So we have not necessarily internalized this hard budget constraint, and until such time we internalize that hard budget constraints through public reforms, is when things will start moving in the right direction. Thank you very much, Abba. The end of the presentation.
As usual, direct to the point and not scared to put out your views strongly as you do. So I've already had a couple of requests about sharing the file, your presentation. So that's been shared. So colleagues, if you want, you can download it from the chat. And then as Wandile gets out of your presentation and we put up the program, again, just to welcome all the colleagues that have joined the meeting. So, we've, as I indicated, we thought let's not jump into the debates that came about last week when the minister presented his medium-term budget policy statement the week before, the 1st of November. So time has flown. But we hope that we can have a more reflective discussion on this. So, colleagues, I'd like to ask, the program has got Michael Sachs, Portia Darby, Kenneth Creamer, and Mamoketi Lejane. So if I could start with Michael, just giving about 5 minutes input. Michael, you've been arguing that this wasn't a midterm budget. This was a completely new budget. But what's your views on the points Machete is raising, and how do we go forward from here? Over to you, Michael.
Thanks, Abba, and thanks for the opportunity. And thanks to Machete for an excellent summary of the longer term direction that we're on and the contents of the MTBPS. And I think broadly speaking, I'm very much aligned with what he was saying. But I don't want to stick on where we agree. I would rather focus on where maybe I don't have differences, but a slightly different perspective. And the first is around spending cuts and bold decisions. And I don't think this is a disagreement at all with what Machete is saying. But I think the important point for me is that in order to fix the budget, you have to fix policy. The budget is the tail and policy is the dog. And the tail can no longer wag the dog. When the MTBPS was first conceived of in the 1990s, the idea was that it would be the financial program of government, or we would take the policy program of government and put forward a financial counterpart of that program. And so the task of the budget is to indicate how government's policy program is going to be financed. But what we have seen increasingly over the years, and particularly in the last 5 years, I must say, is the budget moving in one direction and the policy program moving in a completely different direction. And so essentially, I would say these bold decisions that need to be taken are not budget decisions or spending decisions. They're policy decisions about the structure and content of government's policy package. And decisions need to be taken in order and once policy decisions are taken, then budget decisions can follow. So let me give you an example. Government, I mean, there's many obvious examples. For instance, the Social Relief of Distress Grant, introduced 4 years ago. 4 years later, no clear policy decision has been taken about it. When we look at state-owned companies, the definition here vary, but one of the big adjustments that was made in this adjustment budget was to shift about 700 million rand within SANRAL, from SANRAL's non-toll program to SANRAL's toll program. So SANRAL is kind of divided into two. It has non-toll programs, which are the roads we all drive, the national and provincial roads we all drive along without paying tolls. And that budget has been cut. So that is a cut to road spending on infrastructure in roads in rural areas, townships, and more generally across the country, in order to finance GFIP, the Gauteng Freeway Improvement Program. And the reason Treasury is being forced to do that is because it's now 15 years and no decision has been taken about e-tolls. So there's a limit to what the budget can do to resolve these problems. Government needs to make a decision about e-tolls. Either we have e-tolls or we don't have e-tolls. And this interminable debate about it that never seems to reach a conclusion results in really perverse outcomes in the budget. That's the first point. The second point where I might disagree slightly or frame things differently from the way Machete has put them is this idea that, so I agree we're in a very serious fiscal squeeze. And in the absence of bold decisions being made, we continue along a path which is raising the temperature or raising the extent of that fiscal squeeze. Debt service costs are rising. This is crowding out social spending. But I don't think of the fiscal crisis as being an event that may happen in the future. So often people talk about a fiscal cliff, or we look to a country like Argentina, and we see that Argentina reaches a point where its debt is no longer sustainable, and it defaults on its debt, and what follows, and that is the fiscal crisis. I don't think that is that's not the way I think about it in South Africa's context, because unlike Argentina, the debt relation in South Africa is not a relation between the South African economy and international capital. The debt relation in South Africa is between the sovereign, the state, and domestic financial institutions and domestic households. And in those conditions, the way a fiscal crisis plays out is very different. I would strongly recommend this morning in Business Day, there is an op-ed by Hilary Joffe, which articulates things that I've been thinking and saying for quite some time along these lines, that essentially, as the pressure rises, government has resort to various mechanisms to ensure that it continues to be financed. But resort to those mechanisms comes with costs. So the first thing it can resort to is weakening the asset side of its own balance sheet. And government has huge, or the public sector have huge assets, sets of assets. That includes the much debated recently JAFECRA, the valuation gains on foreign exchange reserves. It includes the GPF and the massive surpluses on the UIF, which don't seem to be serving any purpose. It includes the balance sheet of the Reserve Bank, which is extremely strong and well kind of resourced. So the first port of call as the fiscal pressure mounts will be increasing pressure on government to use those assets in different ways to prevent, to avoid this fiscal crisis, this kind of cliff. So I don't think of it as and then once you've kind of gone down that path, it's quite possible that you begin to look beyond the public sector balance sheet into the balance sheet of the private sector and private banks and private pension funds. And then you shift from a situation, you know, in public finances, there's a fundamental difference between taxation and debt, in the sense that taxation is compulsory. You don't pay taxes because you like it, it's the law. And if you don't pay your taxes, you go to jail. Debt, on the other hand, is a voluntary relationship. But government, as well as being the largest issuer of debt in the economy, is also presides over the regulation of debt markets. And so it has the capacity to begin shifting debt from a voluntary relationship to a compulsory relationship. And then we get into compulsory financing, which economists often call financial repression. So I think that there's a long path, and once you go down these paths, you avoid the fiscal cliff, but you impose other costs on the economy. And the bottom line is that when you use these assets, you know, you can creatively use the balance sheet and the assets to give yourself breathing space and time to address the underlying fundamental problems. So, for example, you could use the valuation gains on our foreign reserves, otherwise known as the GIFECRA, to offset the financial crisis at Eskom and Transnet and to repair the balance sheets of Eskom and Transnet, which are now in crisis. And that would give you breathing space and time to resolve the fundamental problems that face Eskom and Transnet and restructure those
Michael, I think you're frozen.
Am I
Okay.
back with you now?
Yeah, now we can hear you again. Thank you.
Yeah. So I was saying I'm reaching, this is my last point mainly, and I'm opening the door, the path for Portia. So I'm saying you could use government's assets to create breathing space for government to address the fundamental problems in Eskom, on Transnet and other state-owned companies. And that makes a lot of sense to do. On the other hand, you can use those assets to create a buffer and precisely so that you can avoid addressing the fundamental problems in those institutions and just keep funding them so that they can keep deteriorating in the way that they have in recent decades. And it's not clear which kind of path we're going down. So I will stop there and hand over to the next panelist. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Michael. As usual, I wish we could allow you to go on much longer, but you'll get a chance to come back to it. Colleagues, I'll also ask the panelists to keep an eye on the chat and the questions that are coming up there. And I'll go through that and we can work out who will be responding to it. Also, my apologies that none of your titles have been included in the program. So thank you, Professor Michael Sachs. I can go to Portia Darby, Director of Ubu Holdings. Over to you, Portia.
Thank you very much, Abba, and thanks for the invite. I'm just trying, so I'm going to try and be brief. I agree pretty much with in fact, most of the things that you've said, Michael. And I actually do think this issue of alignment between budget and policy, I absolutely think is critical. And I also agree wholly that it starts with policy and it goes to budget. But I also think the tough thing for us to do in South Africa is actually to make choices, because we can't chase everything. So when I was listening to Machete, I worry about sort of using words that suggest greater crises or cause. They have a particular meaning, like the structural deficit. I'm not entirely sure that we're there. I mean, I think we've got a much bigger problem in South Africa, which is revenue. If I take it to its basics, which is related to GDP growth, we've just not had it. I mean, I looked at in the past decade, we've been languishing just around 1%, thereabout in the past couple of years. We've just not, on average, if you look at over the period, we've just not been able to grow at the rate that we saw now and again, unfortunately, not on a consistent basis in the early 2000s. And so for me, a 4.9% GDP deficit is high, but it's not the end of the world. I mean, the US is sitting at 5.7%. And I think the point that you raised, Michael, around what is the greatest source of funding of debt in South Africa? It's a lot more for dependence on internal sources, except the fact that there's actually foreign debt that we've also incurred in South Africa, which does in some ways limit what you are able to do. So for me, the challenge with the 4.9% GDP deficit would be to ask the question, what then? What are the sources of growth going forward? Now, when you look even at the very own Treasury, when they sort of like indicate why there's a shortage of the shortfall on the revenue side, it's public sector wages, which have increased, it's interest costs, and then there's always this lurking thing, and I'm very uncomfortable with this one, is that social services costs are too high. Frankly, as far as I'm concerned, I think it's something that we've got to deal with. When you consider the fact that a living wage is 7,000 Rand in South Africa and 350 Rand, I think it helps to sober you up, number one. Number two, if you're sitting with the narrow definition of unemployment at 33%, I just think, there's a lot of things which are associated, which are obvious on top of that, which is, I think, we have to continue to have the social expenditure that we have, because frankly, you need to buy the space for you to be able to fix the economy so that you can be able to have growth on the other side. So back to this point, is that when you look at gross fixed capital formation at 6.2%, when you actually in the NDP are saying that by 2030 you should be at 30%, that's 7 years from today, you should be at 30% of GDP. Now, why is gross fixed capital formation important? It's important for driving sentiment into the future and confidence, right? Because it's a lead indicator of where growth is going to be coming from in the economy. If you're at 6.2, and then if you look at the details on the MTB, the BPS, it indicates that drops to about 3.6%. So my core worry actually is that you are actually eating away at the thing that is supposed to help you exit out of this situation where you are in, where you start seeing growth on the other side. So for me, growth drivers are, you can't, unfortunately, the economy requires a strong health system because workers need to be taken care of. It requires a strong education system. So I must say, I'm deeply concerned as well about the NSFAS cuts. And I want to separate out the issues which are around administration and management and corruption, right? Because those are three issues that we absolutely have to deal with. Because if we get lost in the fact that there's corruption, we don't manage properly, and then you suddenly flip yourself towards saying, oh, well, let the private sector provide everything. Just what do you do to the vast majority of South Africans? And you basically hold them in a debt trap. You hold them out of the economy. The very thing that you allegedly say you're trying to deal with, which is exclusion, is that you keep them out at the end of the day. So I do think that we've actually, when I look at even on the points of reform, I'd say this issue of policy and budget, and then strengthening management and administration. Absolutely agree. But peace and security is tied. If you're going to have economic growth, I can only just speak at the horrors that we had to go through, but that Transnet still continues to have, and not only Transnet, by the way, it's Transnet, it's Eskom, it's telcos companies with cable theft. And it's a fact known, and it's only just cable theft, is the level of insecurity that South Africans live with generally across the board. So if you do not have continued increased spending, and not actually just only on the sophisticated bits and bobs about security, but man on the beat, police person walking the streets. It has the benefit on the one hand of creating jobs, but also associated benefit on the other is that it increases confidence amongst consumers. The other issues, that are raised, which I support that we need to deal with as a matter of urgency, is this issue of electricity. Lots of other issues attached to the way that we've been going about it. The risk of ensuring that we don't, in the end, create another source of poverty where there are those who have electricity and energy and those we've left out once again. I think that's a real big concern. I must say, and it's a bias, and so you can attack me if you want, it's fine. I'm absolutely uncomfortable with this idea of bailout. And in fact, I'm always shocked when the government itself talks about funding its own SOCs as a bailout. A bailout for me is when the state comes in and buys African Bank. That's a private entity where the state comes in and it's bailing out the private sector. When it is your own entity, I agree, you have a couple of obligations. There is a restructuring that needs to happen. There are way too many of them in South Africa. But if, in fact, indeed, and I think this is something, and I think you could objectively prove it, that if you have underinvested, the issue of fixing the balance sheets once and for all, and then ensuring that what's on the other side is the restructured sector, so that there's an effective interplay between the private and the public sector going forward, I think absolutely crucial. So I'd align myself, and in fact, I'd be quite interested in hearing, because it's quite useful listening to you, Michael, on the innards of the funding, the real other funding options that would be available, that for most of us who've never been in the budget office, it's always quite intriguing to hear that there are actually other options other than the obvious, which is mass privatization in a crisis, which only serves to enrich those who have and exclude those who don't have. Abba, I'll stop here. So for me, my big issue is you can't say that you have a revenue problem, and yet when you look at the budget and the cuts and things like that, there doesn't seem to be an active engagement with what are going to be the drivers of GDP growth going forward, so that you can find yourself slowly moving out of the current challenge that we have. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Portia. Really appreciate it. And bringing in some of those real issues and concerns in the economy that we need to be factoring in looking at the budget responses. Dr. Kenneth Creamer, a senior lecturer at Wits in economics and finance at Wits University. Over to you.
Hi there, Abba. Can you hear me? And see
Loud
me?
and clear.
Oh, great. Could I ask that I'm able to share my screen, please? If the current screen can be taken down, it won't let me. Thank you.
Great. There we go.
Thanks a lot. All right. So yes, thanks for the opportunity, Abba, and for the others who invited me to this event. And I need these slides just to help me remember what I wanted to say. I can just close off here as well. Must be a way of moving this out of the way. Here we go. All right. So I think the comments from Machete, Portia, Michael are all very interesting, and hopefully I will contribute to the discussion in some ways. I think that as a starting point, we are already in a fiscal crisis. I think Michael explained that it's going to be some kind of ongoing quagmire until we can pull ourselves out of it. I would contend that the solution to our fiscal crisis is not really to be found in fiscal policy. The solution is going to be through our growth strategy. If you look at the slide in front of you, you can see that's the periods. During the apartheid era, average growth was 44.9%. During the crisis of apartheid, when before the 1994 transition, growth fell to 2%. During the early days of our transition, driven a lot by the global commodity cycle, our growth was averaging 3.2% per year. And now we're down to 1.5% per year. And this is the source of our crisis. is the low growth that we're experiencing. The MTBPS, it says that we are going to grow by 0.8% in 2023, so it's even below this the current crisis period. And it projects that growth might grow by 1.4% in the next 2 years, which is, I mean, well below the crisis of apartheid. You know, we really are not growing at a sufficient rate. So I think that creates the context that says we really need to do things differently, Abba. You know, we can't carry on doing things the same way. And I think one of the key points I want to reflect on in this panel discussion today is that I think the MTBPS did start to show the way as to how things could be done differently, particularly with regard to the constraints that have been imposed through our logistics and our energy crisis. And hopefully the Treasury is able to convince government and society, as well as those who are in favor of such difference, that we can pursue this route of doing things differently. I was interested in your scenarios that you presented yesterday. The one scenario for South Africa is we'll be a bunch of hardy-das making a big noise. The others will continue being a bunch of vultures eating whatever we can. Or will we be like the weaver birds that can cooperate together and build a huge nest together, that we can live in a more equal society? And you know, so that is what is our growth story? But what is our growth story? And I think the minister reflected some of that. If I can just try and read what he said here. He said, the MTBS on electricity and transport, it said, we're going to take into account not just a particular entity, but the transformation of the sector as a whole. So we need to unpack, what does he mean by this? On electricity, it means we have to balance putting some money into extending the life of Eskom's coal-fired power stations, which he reflected on a report that he's received and will be releasing in that regard, versus the need to reform and restructure the sector as a whole to enable investment in new technology and new generation transmission and distribution capacity. So in a cryptic way, I see the MTBPS is signaling that we will start to do things differently. To solve load shedding, we're not going to only focus on saving Eskom. To sort out our logistics, we're not just going to try and sort out Transnet. I don't really agree with what I think Portia was saying, that through involving more private sector, we're only going to benefit the rich in our society. I think by doing things differently in electricity and Transnet and in logistics, we will benefit the poor if we do it correctly. Because if we're able to export our agricultural goods, if we're able to lift investment by having reliable access to electricity, those who are getting jobs, I mean, let's not forget our unemployment rate, will be benefiting from that. That tide will lift all of us. On rail, the MTBPS said the National Treasury is working with Transnet and the DPE to ensure that Transnet can meet its immediate obligations. Broader reforms of the logistics sector will be guided by the Freight Logistics Roadmap. So this is that theme that we're hearing from the Minister of Finance, from the National Treasury, that we're going to do things differently. We're going to conceive of the problem as fixing logistics and fixing energy rather than just fixing the state-owned companies is just part of that process. Maybe they'll have to downsize to become profitable. You know, they'll have to. They're going to have to restructure in order to play a role in the broader reforms of the sector. But unfortunately, there are contradictions in our thinking. So while cryptically we can maybe read that the Minister of Finance is signaling these reforms, you will find other parts of government and other parts of our political process talk differently. So they'll argue that we must bring the state-owned companies under their line ministries. I don't know if you've seen that one. So the Energy and Transport Ministries should be actually, as we've said, about economy-wide reforms. And they should not just be about managing Eskom and Transnet. So the line ministries are meant to be the repositories of this reform that the Minister of Finance is signaling, where they're saying we're going to fix the energy sector, we're going to fix logistics, but there's a contradiction where they seem to be wanting to grab the state-owned company. And there's quite the consequence of that contradiction is that, as Michael put it, the tail will wag the dog, where the interest of the state-owned company then define the policy for electricity or for logistics. That's definitely what we do not need, that form of capture by those interests. Why do we have these contradictory thoughts? I'm trying to work it out. I've got 2 bullet points here. Are we simply wrong-headed? Is possible. These are complicated things and we can get wrong-headed. Or secondly, is it about power, patronage, and corruption? That people would say, no, our minister must control Transnet. Our minister must control Eskom. Or is it just complicated and we're finding it difficult to work out the relationship between the state-owned company and the broader transition, for example, of the energy sector or the logistics sector? So I think this is a major contradiction between what we're hearing the Minister of Finance say in his speech and what we're hearing government say at other levels regarding who controls this process and what is the locus of this reform process. There is a second proposal on the table regarding a state holding company to control the most strategic state-owned companies. I think there's some merits in that proposal because it tries to at least keep separate that policy function of the broader reform of the whole economy from the need to restructure the state-owned companies. But I think it's many points have been raised that it doesn't necessarily save us from state capture, especially if the power is too centralized in appointing that state-owned company. And it doesn't really grasp the nettle of the reforms that are needed. It's in that sector that the real reforms, the real dynamism is going to be coming through the correct design of our energy and logistics sectors. And I think the state-owned governments that we put in place should really seek to avoid this kind of moral hazard. The problem with blending policy and shareholder responsibilities is it creates serious moral hazard. For example, electricity, what is good for an industry experiencing this energy transition will not always be good for Eskom. Eskom has to restructure and be fit for purpose in order to ensure that we are able to bring in the new technologies that are required, the new structures, the new market structures that are required. And the point that I'd like to make is, these reforms have, under the Ramaphosa presidency, there have been movements in this direction. So there has been an easing of the state monopoly in electricity provision. We're allowing companies to produce their own electricity, which has been very helpful directly in reducing some degree of load shedding. But it also is good for the economy. If you look at this, I see one of our panelists here, Mamokete, your pictures here in the newspaper. And this is an August report where it says the recent surge in renewable energy investments most likely explains the recent strong rise in construction employment, which has increased by 108,000 jobs over the past 12 months. And by 104,000, there's a zero missing there, jobs in the past quarter. This is quoting Kevin Lings from Stanlib. So this is just an example of how reforms do work. If we can free ourselves from wrong-headed thinking, from political patronage, and from people who are trying to be vultures over our state-owned companies, and we can allow for reforms where the balance sheets of private companies are brought into play, where we say it's no longer a pure monopoly situation of a power generation in this country and licensing reforms are brought into place. This has broader positive economic consequences, in this case, with regard to employment creation. So this is just a small example. If we had to do things differently in logistics and energy over a sustained period with clear thinking and policy thinking, I think that the economic potential will be great. And as I said at the beginning, this will get us out of the fiscal crisis. Cutting and taxing and cutting spending and taxing and borrowing and using our gold reserves, that is not going to get us out of the fiscal crisis. It has to be through doing things differently in a way that stimulates growth and employment creation. Obviously, these reforms are complicated and they will imply more reforms. So today's solution that Kenneth Creamer is proposing will be tomorrow's problem and will require further reforms. It's an ongoing process of strategic state planning and policy implementation. So, for example, the NTBS signals that. It says we're going to need new funding models for municipalities so they can continue to earn revenue as more self-generation is happening by firms and households. Our local governments are in serious crisis, and we need to have we need to have connection fees, access to service fees. It cannot just be based, for example, on use-based tariffs, because households and firms are checking out of the grid. They're becoming prosumers, consumers, and we need to catch up rapidly to ensure that our reforms today don't create, well, they will create tensions, but don't create a deeper crisis tomorrow. For example, also Eskom, as it restructures, it requires new models of funding. Electricity markets mean that there's going to be competitive generation in that sector. It's a brave new world. We have to be charging for wheeling, virtual wheeling, all kinds of new models will be required to ensure that when we open up to these new technologies, when we move away from state monopoly to competition, that we're able to still achieve viable, maybe smaller state-owned companies, viable pro-poor policies as well. So my last bullet point there is we don't want to have a situation where we have a few islands of electricity in a sea of poverty, where people have got no electricity. We need to make sure that we are adjusting our local government. We can still provide poor households. There's been some interesting research on that poor households have the right to free electricity, but increasingly they're not being given access to that free indigent service. So once we allow the dynamism of the doing things differently to solve our crisis, there's going to be a lot to be done to ensure that the poor are not left behind. So then just to end, Abba, I hope I haven't taken too long. As a friend of the finance minister, I don't know if he has many, I do think that the MTBPS walks a middle line. He walks between the left and the right through this process. I mean, on the left, we hear that debt is not a real constraint. Debt is an artificial constraint. There's a mistake there. Debt is an artificial constraint. If we spend more, we will grow more. If we don't even need to borrow. We can print money. There's a lot of that resonance happening on the left side of our debate. My argument is this is really an illusory path, one that appears to be expansionary, but which will rapidly be contractionary for South Africa. So a flirtation with macroeconomic populism will result in reduced capital flows, rapid currency depreciation, lack of hard currency for technological inputs, power stations, trains, rail systems, the risk of future debt defaults, and yes, ultimately an international constraint will reveal itself. As much as we are maybe stronger than Argentina, as Michael says, in terms of our domestic situation, I'm much less sanguine about that. I think if we followed a route of macroeconomic populism, we will soon come up against our balance of payments constraints and international constraints. On the right, if you read what they say, and I'm sure you have, Abba and others, government is profligate. In practice, the political manipulation has already replaced fiscal discipline. This is what the right wing is saying. I mean, I think there's a risk in that. There's no doubt there's a risk in that. But I do think the MTBPS holds a middle line. It shows a commitment to trying to restore fiscal balances and with a degree of maybe credibility, which is a bit low. But it also tries to mandate these structural reforms, these private-public partnerships, the fixing logistics and energy in a way that these are difficult reforms, but it signals that these difficult decisions can be made. And it's not just simply captured by those who say, oh, the line minister will take over. The MTBPS comes down in support of some politically difficult decisions, at least in words. Now, obviously, words have to be followed by deeds. And I think that if there was a political support to the Treasury, to the presidency, to other forces in government that are trying to lead these reforms, it would be beneficial to our longer-term growth project. But my very last point, Abba, as you know, is this is a highly contested space. The Hardy-Dars are making a noise. It's very difficult. And we can easily be destabilized and fall into what the right wing is warning us of, where our political class is motivated by power grabs or neo-patrimonialism or whatever it may be. So unfortunately, I can't end on a very optimistic note. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kenneth. I really appreciate the various inputs, but especially for plugging the scenarios. So colleagues who missed it, on the chat, there's a link to the Indlula Mithi website where you can look at the scenarios at your leisure. And obviously the scenarios try and do some long-term thinking and speculation about where the country could go, and the idea would be to force policymakers to start taking that into account and look at how we respond. Kenneth, if you don't mind, I've already got requests. If you could share your PowerPoints, if you could put that on the chat, we really appreciate it. I also want to indicate that after Mamakete, I'm going to call on Kanti Pai, especially now in his new role as chief economist at the PwC, to give us his comments before we go into some of the questions that have been raised in the chat, which I'll ask the colleagues on the panel to start looking at. Okay, over to you, Mamakete.
Good morning, and thank you for the invitation. I don't know why the poor banker person has to come last after everybody's made their comments. I think most of what I wanted to say was actually covered.
Because we know you're such an original thinker, you know.
Everybody's already said everything that I'd wanted to say. But I think, you know, I'm not going to go on long, like I said, because a lot of the ground has already been covered. But if I think about my commentary around the budget, as well as the presentation that was made by Machete, I think what is clear, and it comes through quite strongly in Kenneth's comments, is that there are profound failures, I think, at the center of economic policy management in South Africa. And I think the comments come through quite strongly, you know, from Michael and Kenneth as well, that the MTBPS sits downstream of that. So, and I think what we need to recognize is that the whole system has feedback loops, and we're in the middle of a negative feedback loop spiral. So you have low growth, low revenue, high deficits, high debt service costs, low service delivery, you know, low growth, and the whole thing is a feedback loop. When I looked at the MTBPS, and I think with every statement from probably 2018-19, what I was looking for is a signal that something has changed in that feedback loop. So it can come from an MTBPS, it can come from a budgeting process, but it also comes from, you know, all the talk around structural reforms, you know, what the outlook is for growth. And it also comes from what is happening globally as well, because as we saw in 2020, 2021, and 2022, the global environment can give us that breathing room and create the policy room for South Africa as well. So all of these things come together in this mix, and you need to get something, like I always say, you know, when you're caught in the spiral where things are going in one direction, you just need something that is going to be the spoke in that feedback mechanism. So something that slows down you know, the rate of change, which is so negative, so things can speed it up and things can slow it down. Definitely 21, 22, you had, you know, a very supportive global environment. And as a consequence, that feedback loop slowed down. 2020, it speeded up. And right now, I think we need to acknowledge that we're in an environment where it's speeding up, partly because the global environment is not particularly supportive. And so, you know, what happens internally becomes a lot more critical. So we keep saying, oh, the next budget is the most important. And I'm telling you now, the next budget in February is going to be more important than the MTBPS. And if we don't do the right things to slow down that momentum, the next one is going to be even more important. So we are in a state of deepening crisis. I do agree that we're in a crisis. So has the MTBPS done anything to change my view around whether it's the velocity or the direction? No, it hasn't. And so we'll look again at the next statement and then the statement after that to look for this decisive break in terms of where we're going. So then the question that a lot of people ask is, you know, is the debt problem an issue? Because, you know, there's a lot of proposals around, you can use different parts of liquidity that you have in the system. I think Michael spoke quite in quite a bit of depth around where those reside, you know, to kind of like at least buy you time. And I agree that, you know, you're already in a state of crisis that's already creating its own, you know, toxic, you know, feedback mechanism. You know, if you think about where banks sit relative to government debt. Banks are already holding more government debt than they have in South Africa's history. And so if you have failure at state level, so this idea that, oh, if all the debt is local debt, then it's not a problem. It's actually quite systemic. And you've also got in South Africa another issue that we haven't even spoken about, a massive externalization of savings. So, and you've already got an erosion of those pools of liquidity that would otherwise be available for investment in other things. So the sort of classic crowding out. We know that within our system, the highest returning investment is government debt. So all of those kind of what do you call, like, blocks are already in place. And then if you think that this is not a crisis, I think if you look at how the market is behaving, and it's not just, we talk a lot about the actual cost of debt, and we talk about how expensive debt is in real terms. You look at where bond yields are relative to the repo rate, for example, and everybody's saying there's a big problem there. But I also think if you look at the kind of like uncertainty, so you're almost like in crisis management reactive zone as far as fiscal policy is concerned. So I think Mashete I spoke to this idea that you're moving from, there's so many in budget or in year adjustment in the budget that it's become an unpredictable indicator of where policy actually sits. Michael spoke a little bit about the fact that you have a new budget instead of an MTBPS. So the MTF process itself, so the medium-term expenditure or medium-term fund or planning cycle seems to be broken. And you have a budget process that's highly, highly reactive. And as a consequence, you have funding decisions that themselves are highly reactive. If you look at how markets are responding, how policymakers are responding, how unpredictable they've become, I think that itself is an indicator of fragility and explains to some extent why there's such high risk premia built into multiple funding sources for the state, which itself increases the cost of debt. So, I look at it and I say, is a failure at National Treasury, or is it because Treasury is itself responding to forces that are highly unpredictable, that they cannot influence, and they themselves are reactive? And I think that's a big question mark that we're all trying to deal with at the moment from a markets perspective. What is actually going on? What we do know, though, is that it's become much, much more difficult to predict what is coming from one budget to the next, and that in and of itself is creating problems. The other thing that I think I wanted to comment on briefly, Portia spoke about, the provision of services by the public sector, and I think Kenneth spoke to that again. And I think I agree with Kenneth. It's a matter of design, but also it does, I think, introduce a different problem for South Africa when you have public goods being provided by the public sector or by the private sector. That in and of itself is because, you've got profound problems at a fiscal level. So government doesn't have the resources that it needs to provide services. So you're veering the service delivery away from the public into the private sector. And I think it's going to be interesting to see, what downstream problems that creates. And then I think at the heart of it, I started by saying there are profound failures at the center of economic management in South Africa. It's not a fiscal issue. It sits somewhere else, or at least there is an interplay between those two areas. I think, that's one thing that Kenneth started to talk to a little bit, but we need to ask ourselves, what is it that is happening at a political economy level that is creating a situation that makes it very difficult for us to respond, in a way that is constructive and that gets us out of this mess. So there's, I think, an understanding on the whole that South Africa has got everything that it needs from a resource perspective to break this negative feedback loop that I've spoken about. But something is stopping that from happening. It is not, I don't think, at Treasury. So we need to find what that source is and actually deal with it, or at least start discussing, instead of having big discussions around fiscal policy, around growth policy, actually start to say, where's the problem really at, and I don't have an answer for this, but how do we solve that problem once we've kind of identified it? But then at least we'll be having a discussion about where the source is, as opposed to talking about things that are downstream, while ignoring essentially the elephant in the room. So I could say more, but I'd be happy to stop there.
Okay, thank you very much, Mamke. And I'm not going to take up any more time. I know we've been kind of slipping a little bit. Maybe our time allocations were too tight as well. So my apologies for that. But let me ask Tanti Pai to come in and make his comments.
Thank you. I'm not sure if I'm audible.
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay. Thanks. One of the things that I thought was interesting, and that's I was out for a while here, so I'm not sure if there was any discussion on this. But one of the key things that we've been really talking about is this the collaboration, because I think one of the things that emerged very strongly in the budget, and there are about few lines in which the budget really talks to, can we the government is going to try as far as possible to bring in private sector participation, especially in terms of actually trying to fund infrastructure. Now, I think they talk about this in two ways. The one is, I guess, the I think what the former minister used to call private, I think he didn't call them investors, but sort of privatization story. But there's one that we have been talking about here that actually allows three things that are really, really important, where business, for a long time, especially in local government and municipalities, where they are very, very close to the problems and to the infrastructure deficits, whether it's water or energy, and some of which actually have affected their own businesses. Over the past month or 3 months, actually, I've been spending a lot of time with businesses in the manufacturing sector, especially, who have got really serious problems in the local government space. And in spaces where actually in those local governments, there isn't really money in which they will be able to fund this kind of infrastructure. But also it's infrastructure, also in mining actually, that needs to be funded even to support communities, and how that is going to work together. Now, there are two things I think the Treasury is going to do very, very, they have to think about very importantly, is in the first instance, how they're actually going to spend time thinking about in what ways can they allow the kind of expenditure models that allow business to not just participate in co-funding, but in a way that allows and grows accountability between the private sector and the public sector without actually privatizing public infrastructure. This is an interesting thing because one of the things that are very important is obviously when we audit these things where the private sector cannot come and buy public infrastructure in a manner that says, well, we're going to just come in here and this we own, this because we co-funded it. But that actually they sort of, but they've actually been able to help in the growing of a governance infrastructure that works better than what we've had before. So in a governance mechanism, but not so much in the ownership mechanism. But also that because communities are fully engaged in that, they are also going to participate. Then it provides safety to everyone in a way that we've all been, I think many people have been talking about this. In what way can we actually keep each other accountable from the different social partners? So this language that's very strong in the budget around bringing private sector to fund infrastructure has to be thought through very, very clearly in terms of what question we are trying to answer, which is to bring in the resources that are necessary, but also to provide accountability, to provide co-ownership, so that as time goes by, we reduce the big risk that many people have been talking about, and certainly we've been talking about around how do we avoid a situation in which the disenfranchisement of communities, of people, of youth, can be actually undone in the manner that we've seen it in terms where we've got social, what have they been called, those municipal disruptions that we've seen and people burning infrastructure, that there is some way in which you can create a model that answers a number of questions and actually also sorts out longer term issues that we have in social issues. So I think one of the key things that I noticed very, very important in this budget has been that this understanding that perhaps, and then lastly, of course, this is not a discussion about whether or not we are actually offering incentives, but that actually we are solving common problems that have been there. And then lastly, I was in a very interesting discussion with the Consumer Goods Council not so long ago. One of the contributors said that many of the problems that we are facing on infrastructure, on service delivery, have been faced by communities for years and years and years. It is only now that the private sector is feeling the pinch that they sort of starting to talk about private sector participation, but this should have been what we've been going with, a model that we should have worked with for a long time about how we collaborate and actually deliver our services that both serve in a very important way. And again, I think one of the businesses that we were talking to said, when they started doing the collaboration, one of the things that they got was much more improved relations with the community and also with their workers, because their conditions improved markedly because they participated in that. So there are a number of questions, I think, and opportunities that emerge from this budget around private sector participation, but there are more important questions about how you actually form and format that to actually make sure that the outcomes that you seek are the ones that actually you're going to get. So I thought that might be an important contribution from what the budget has said. And so I'm hoping I'm not just repeating what has been talked about.
No, I think that's quite an important point you're making there, Khanti. So really appreciate that. I think I'm selecting, there's a lot of discussion in the chat. So colleagues, if you can have a look at that. But I think some of the interesting, they're all interesting, but some of the ones that do need a bit of response. Talib, good to see you here. And he says, agree we need to focus on expenditure, but is the revenue shortfall of 54 billion, structural? Who are the contributors to the shortfall, and what are the right things that need to be done to reverse the revenue shortfall? Ghulam has made a few inputs, but I think the key question is, what are the key elements of a feasible growth strategy? Ludumo speaks about gaining efficiencies, improving effectiveness of spending. We cannot afford to allocate funds to a problem. And I think that's quite an important one about capacity and capability. And I think, we see it in all the government departments, but I think it's so dire at the level of municipalities, the level of underspending, and the ability to do that or not. And maybe if I can throw in, if there could be one of the panelists could respond to the role of the DBSA in this whole mix, so let me leave it at that. What kind of role you have? Then Jabu, thank you for all your inputs there. And thank you also for your confidence in suggesting that a credible organization like MISTRA should have this kind of discussions with government. But quite a specific one that you've asked of Kenneth, the DMR is running the INEP program focusing on poor household delivery. Are you suggesting that the program is not working, or is it ineffective? And Takuseni has raised an important point about Regulation 28 in relation to the 40% allocation for an infrastructure, and what impact will increase allocation of 45% foreign asset exposure have for domestic investment. So there's quite a lot of different questions there. I think the important I think also the private sector role that I think Mamokete and Khanti bring in are important considerations. Like, how do we make sure that we've got the kind of roles that we expect of the private sector to be playing, but within the kind of overall developmental objectives that government has set out. Are there any particular views? I'm curious also, any particular views on the holding company for the SOEs? Do we see this as us going back to a previous era, or will this really help us take things forward? And then I think the whole, the point that a number of you have emphasized, the relationship between policy and budget. What's going to take that? I mean, by all accounts, the kind of process within the ANC, if one were to specifically refer to them, is a long drawn-out process. And I think colleagues around the table and in the room are battling on some of the issues there. But how do we get policy being addressed in a way that matches with the demands of the current situation? So I'm going to ask colleagues to respond in the same order they spoke. And I'm going to give you 5 minutes each. This time I'll be a little bit more firm. But if you can also refer to any issues, so it's your chance to respond and make any concluding remarks. So Professor Sachs, over to you.
Sorry, I thought Machete was coming first, but anyway.
So I'll have him last. Sorry, I should have said, Machete, you will speak last.
So I think, I mean, there's so many questions, it's hard to say where to start, but I think that there's consensus really amongst us, and I think amongst everybody, is the consensus that fiscal policy is not really the fundamental problem in South Africa, and neither is it the solution. So as Kenneth says, you know, the direction of a kind of populist macroeconomics that I was listening to Treasury this morning in Parliament responding to civil society positions, and they were saying something very, very similar, that a kind of demand-led economic expansion doesn't make much sense in a context where the supply side of the economy, whether that's electricity, whether that's logistics, whether that's municipal infrastructure, is really the key constraint. On the other hand, it's important, I mean, so as Mamokiti put it, there's a vicious cycle that we are in, where rising lower economic growth and higher interest rates lead to rising government debt because revenue is falling. And that rising government debt creates new risks in the economy, which pushes up interest rates and deters investment, then feeding into a vicious cycle of lower growth and higher interest rates. The question I think that Mamokiti put very well is, does the MTBPS chart some way out of this problem? And I think others have said, well, maybe in the case of state-owned companies and some of the structural reforms, it begins to signal some path out of this vicious cycle, perhaps. But in a fiscal sense, my view is that actually, were the MTBPS to be implemented as currently designed, it would substantially accelerate this vicious cycle, because it first of all, it proposes such large spending cuts in year that it's very likely that we will see essentially provincial health departments, provincial education departments, and departments across government simply running out of cash and having to abruptly cease their operations. And then next year, it proposes a very large negative fiscal shock, amounting to a contraction of about 3.3%. And the combination, and also a very large reductions in the headcount of government, and a reduction in the size of the state, which will have a direct impact on social services. So as a macro response to this vicious cycle, it is likely to further dampen growth and also disrupt the social provision in a way that will intensify political divisions and threaten social cohesion. And I think those political divisions and social cohesion problems are at the center of why we have bad policy, and why we have low growth, and why we have high interest rates. So I think, I don't think there's a kind of fiscal expansion path out of the current crisis and the vicious cycle. But on the other hand, I think the job of the fiscal authority now is to soften the blow and try to decelerate this to slow down the downward spiral. And I worry that instead, what we have on the table is something that will actually intensify that downward spiral. So I don't think, it's just a comment on the tail and the dog and policy. Policy that doesn't have, that isn't planned, that doesn't indicate how is it going to be resourced, that doesn't indicate what institutions are going to implement the policy, that doesn't indicate how it's going to balance vested interests that will be opposed to that policy, is not policy. It is simply a wish. So we have a wish. So for example, I'll give you an example of the 2014 white paper on post-school education and training, which was the prelude to the crisis in higher education and NSFAS that we face today. That white paper, supposed to said nothing about how the ambitious targets of expanding post-school education would be financed. Said nothing about the relationship between the state and the private sector in skills development and a range of other issues. So it wasn't a policy, it was simply a wish. And so I wouldn't say that kind of an argument that says Treasury must simply finance the policy that government agrees. In a sense, that's the problem. When I was in government, I was in one meeting where a minister said, the problem here is that we take decisions that we take a decision that 2 + 2 must equal 5. And then we leave it to Treasury to come on back and say, well, 2 + 2 actually equals 4. And then we say, that's because you're neoliberal. And and I'm not trying to say there aren't any problems in Treasury, that Treasury doesn't have. Definitely, as I've already said, I think this MTBPS is not necessarily going in the right direction. But when I say the relationship between the policy and budget needs to be addressed, in my view, it's more a problem of policy not recognizing financial and fiscal constraints and attempting to implement everything at the same time as a wish list. That is the central problem that needs to be resolved. Thanks.
Thanks, Michael. Portia, over to you.
Thanks very much, Abba. Can I just apologize in advance? I'll have to comment and leave. Sorry. I anticipated it finishing earlier. So I'll be quick too. So I want to, because I do want to come to, a point, I suppose. So first of all, I back completely the idea from Treasury that you've got to deal with the supply side. And that for me, by the way, Gulam, and hello, is it's in the logistics, water, electricity distribution networks. By the way, for electricity, we don't talk enough about that, and roads, that in the investing in those areas, which are actually natural areas for government to invest, is investing in those areas, you deal with quite a fundamental constraint to economic growth. And also, by virtue of the fact that you've invested in that, it becomes the source for aggregate demand, effectively. It drives up demand. And I think that should definitely lead to benefits. And so the issues, the good things that we're saying about jobs and the rest are start to arise there. But I also wanted to go to a reminder. South Africa has always been about a mixed economy. It has never been about an economy which is dominated neither completely by the state nor by the private sector. So if I'm pushing back, and I am going to continue pushing back with that shamelessly too, is that public good provision by the private sector of necessity raises the risks which you need to watch. And the risks, frankly, we've seen before. It's the issues of who walks away with the rewards and who takes the risks. The very same renewable program, please go and look at what's the risk-reward spread on that side. I'm not quite comfortable with the fact that you need private sector investment, but the risk also that we walk into, and I think in a country as unequal as South Africa, it would be remiss of us not to walk clearly into the space, understanding that the risk of exclusion of the majority of this population exists and remains, and we must address it. So I'm going to be un-PC and not go with you necessarily, Kenneth, on this one. You see, if you look back, actually, and I think we were looking at this and we're working on a paper on oversight of SOEs. Go back to 2000. Some of the challenges around where SOEs locate themselves have been repeating themselves in party conferences over and over again. Now, either we continue to not wanting to engage with that story, and I think it's possible that you can actually come to some compromise between those who believe that SOEs should locate themselves in policy departments and those who believe that they shouldn't. And to a large extent, I'd argue that we should now start looking at the infrastructure, the regulated parts of the economy, which anyway are governed by the regulators and the policies of the sector departments. There's no loss because there's no competition. There in the monopoly service provision, there's no competition with the private sector. It is in any event a monopoly which governs all of us. Absolutely agree that in the SOEs that compete with the private sector, it would be a complete mistake. And we've seen it long enough where they get located inside the policy department, because I agree, policy should be written for the entire sector, not written for an entire, just one SOC. We've seen that as well. So I do think, though, that if we all need to get out of our corners in terms of these ideological perspectives, actually, and say pragmatically, what is an appropriate solution? And I must say, as a pragmatist myself, is that I think, frankly, at this point, most importantly, make a decision, do something, move forward, and then let's fix the outcomes of that. For me, the issues around regulation, and we've not spoken enough. In fact, Abba, I think it's an area of work that MISTRA could focus on. Yes, the thing is that every time you take the private sector and you put it in monopoly service provision, and even as we are deregulating South Africa, you are deregulating and you need to have very strong, competent regulators who ensure that the decisions that they arrive at are decisions that are on the net positive for the South African economy. But I must say, I'm not, for all of the things that I say, I really do think that there are genuine opportunities for growth in the South African economy if we are able to sit together, figure out how we work on a collaborative and joint basis. And I'm afraid, I'll keep on saying this, we need to make sure that we don't take actions that only serve to strengthen the powerful and ensure that we continue to ignore the poor and the excluded parts of our society and economy. But thank you very much, Abba, and everyone else for listening in. Thank you. You muted, Abba.
Oops, sorry. Thank you, Portia, and we'll take up your suggestions as well. Kenneth, over to you.
Yes, hi, thank you. Thanks to Portia and others for their comments. I do believe that it's a question of how do we do what Portia is saying? You know, how do we serve the poor? How do we structurally change our economy? You know, if you remember what Deng Xiaoping said about the color of the cat, you know, I agree with Portia. We are pragmatists. Like, we want the cat that will catch the mice, and we're not too worried about the color. And it's all about designing correctly how we achieve these things and how do we address the poor. And make sure that they are not left structurally destitute outside of this economy. The way that Deng achieved the upliftment of nearly 1 billion people was through a sustained period of 7, 8, 9, 10% growth, you know, and that's what we have to be achieving. And we can't be worried about private sector, public sector, you know, we've just got to design policies that are able to catch those mice. And it's really, this, I agree with her, it's the state and market have to work together in a complementary fashion. If they're trying to win rents off each other, particularly the private sector coming in, trying to win rents and not have competition, not have regulation, that's really not going to help us. But there's also a saying that necessity is the mother of invention. I would love it if we could have a very strong Transnet and Eskom leading our developmental state. But I think if we're going to get development in this state, we're going to have to redesign our policies, do things differently, because they are just too weak now. At the moment, they're not paying dividends. They're being bailed out. So it's not a good term. I agree with Portia, not a good term. But they're having to be funded from the taxpayer. in order to keep going, and that's not strong enough to do the growth that we need. That just the balance sheets are not strong enough to do the investments to modernize our grids. We need billions of rands of investment in transmission infrastructure. We need billions on rail technologies, security technologies. It's just the balance sheet is not there, and that's why we need to design it. To respond to Jabu's very interesting questions, he did raise quite a few, and the direct one regarding the free basic services. The research that I was quoting says that we aim to have 10 million households receiving free electricity, free basic electricity in the 2019-2020 fiscal year. But only 2 million households get free electricity. So yes, that's a lot of households. 2 million are getting free electricity because they fall below the threshold. But we're budgeting for a lot more. And in fact, the difference is about 8 million households. And this is the problem with our weak local government, and you wonder why people are connecting themselves illegally to the grid, because if they have the right to receive the free basic services, but they're not receiving them in practice, we seem to have a big dissonance and paradox between what we say we're going to do and what we are able to do. Then and if the local governments are attempted to use that money to pay salaries or buy vehicles or whatever else it might be, rather than provide the free basic service, and there's not good governance of that, then the policy is only partially successful. Jabu, just to say, the paper is, let me just tell you the title of it. I can't share it that easily, but it's called Broken Promises, Electricity Access for Low-Income Households, and it's published by the Public Affairs Research Institute, PARI, P-A-R-I. And it was published recently. It's a recent paper that you'll see that it isn't working. Sorry, it was published in April 2021, not as recent as April 2021, a working paper. I think there's so much else to talk about, but for me, that's enough for now. Thank you.
Yeah, I really feel apologetic about us allocating so little time. We should have guessed, having all those fine minds come together. But let me not take up any more time. Mamoketi, over to you.
Yeah, so if I don't look okay, I just moved because my battery was dying, so I needed somewhere else to chat from. But just on final comments, I think I'm just going to address Ntakuzeni's questions around Rec 28. There was one also about monetary fiscal coordination, etc. So on Rec 28, we know that at the time of the budget, National Treasury increased the amount that pension funds could allocate to offshore assets from 35 to a maximum of 45. And we suspect that that did create some room for pension funds that had the desire to invest a little bit more offshore to do so. But also, if you look at the evidence since then, we didn't quite see as much money flowing out as we had feared. There was some cash that flowed out as a consequence. But also, when you think about Rec 28, you know that every time the rand depreciates, the holdings of any pension fund in offshore assets appreciate in value. And as a consequence, I think part of the reason was that a lot of these guys were reaching their limits, and just to maybe reduce pressure on them to pull back funding or to pull back investment offshore, that might have been one of the reasons why that was increased. I do agree that that was an interesting adjustment, especially given where we were at the time and our funding needs. But I also think it goes to a much bigger question. What is our fundamental approach and our fundamental understanding of how resources should be allocated? So, and I think it speaks to who holds government bonds. We've seen the state debt portfolio treble almost in the past 10 years. And all that paper, all those investments are sitting somewhere in the investment industry. So you need to ask yourself really hard questions around whether that is, optimal allocation of what is scarce capital, where we are now having so much of our savings being absorbed by the state. And within that context, if you're a saver, is that where you want your cash to go to? And I think it speaks back to Michael's view around, at which point does the instability at on a fiscal level bleed into actual erosion of personal and private sector wealth, be it personal or corporate. And I think that really comes to the heart of it. So how much of that savings pool does a government capture? How much do we want them to capture? And it's a political economy question, really. How much of that do we want them to capture? How much freedom do we want to have around how we invest our assets, whether they stay onshore or offshore, and if they're onshore, in what do we invest? In a context where your equity market has just been a perennial underperformer, largely because the economy is ex-growth. So the returns that you can reasonably expect to get from being invested in equities are non-existent. Should your savings be captured? And it really is a political problem, and I'm going to leave my comments at that. The next issue is around monetary fiscal coordination. Can you manage the cost of your debt by getting that better working, or whatever the case may be. And I think this comes back to the whole thing around, I'll go back to Michael's view, around the different pools of liquidity, one of which is the central bank's balance sheet. So we talked a little bit about unrealized gains on foreign exchange reserves, and if those should be moved to the state. Probably the answer can be yes, it can be. But once you've eroded that pool of liquidity, which is the next pool of liquidity, and this really speaks to the use of the central bank's balance sheet, which is the other question that is very live in a political economy debate. And I think you need to understand that policy credibility is something that is a tool that you can use for other things. You gain it in order to stabilize other parts of the macroeconomic management system or perceptions thereof. And when you erode it at your cost. And I think at the heart of it, this is one of the things that was being discussed at a conference that the Reserve Bank hosted in September, and this was a cross global, starting with the US itself. Actually, is can you have credible monetary policy or a credible central bank when you have profound problems on a fiscal basis? And my answer to that is the answer is no. So fiscal instability itself will breed an erosion of credibility across the whole system, and the central bank cannot be isolated. And I suppose that's why, if you think about all of these things, you need to think about them as a whole. The system the sovereign system is a unified system, even though we've got some infrastructure that creates these discrete things. So SOEs are discrete from the sovereign, which is discrete from the central bank. But if you have distress at any one of those levels, it has to be absorbed across the others, and therefore you cannot have credibility in one when one is failing. And I think that's where we are, and that is one of the feedback mechanisms that we have currently working in our system. That'll be my last comment. Thanks.
I'm sure you would have a lot more to say if you have the time. So I'm sorry, Mamoketi, but looking forward to ongoing engagement. And then Kanti, and then we'll ask Mashete to do the wrap up. Kanti. Is Kanti in? I know he had problems getting in and out. Okay, I think maybe Mashete, if you're ready, let's go for it. You're muted. You're still muted.
So thanks, Abba. I'll try to be short because I'll see if I run out. So when I started the presentation, I said we have a lot of expectations of the budget and the MTBPS. And this discussion the discussion that you just had now really bears testimony to that, because we have not, it is the MTBPS, but we end up speaking about, the whole question about policy and budget nexus. How do you reconcile the two? Reconciliation of the budget and the policy happens through the budget process. So you aggregate all those, policy priorities, and you present them in the budget through how you allocate expenditure. And unfortunately, I think that process is becoming increasingly very weak, and that's why we're having all these discussions about, you know, the linkage between policy and the budget. It's something that we should have been resolved long time ago, and increasingly is because of the fact that there are tensions within the state itself. So Treasury is you know, I mean, there is no agreements between Treasury and some of the spending agencies around what should be, you know, the spending priorities. But we spend a lot of focus. We focus attention on the MTBS itself, when actually where the rubber really hits the road is during the budget process, when some of the spending agencies present their budget at Parliament. That's where exactly we need to be evaluating exactly this, you know, policy issues that we are talking about, whether there's provision made for those policy issues in the budget of the spending agencies, not at an aggregate level where the Minister of Finance making aggregate allocations to different functions. And I think just to respond to the question about structurality, the revenue issue, yes, the fiscal deficit, I think, yes, it is a structural problem because it has been persistent over time. From 2011, we have had this, you know, gap between revenue and expenditure, and it's not closing down, and it does not appear to be going to be closed down anytime soon. So it is a structural issue, and the only way to deal with that is through the structural reforms in the economy. And we've got the ERRP, you know, by the president, which have introduced some level of you know, structural reforms, but they're not very holistic. But because they are too focused on, you know, privatization of the state-owned entities without necessarily looking at holistic, you know, structural reforms in the economy, especially around competition and concentration within the economy. So, and I think lastly, just to end, is that we are not going to achieve, you know, this congruency between budget and policy with a very weak public administration, and we cannot isolate, you know, what happens in the budget to what actually happens within the administration itself. So you also need that kind of public administration reforms to make sure that the allocations that are being made through the budget get to, you know, are more effective. They provide, you know, social services, as the question has been mentioned about how effective is spending. Spending cannot be effective when you've got a very weak administration. And how you address weak administration? You address weak administration through fundamental public service reforms. And just to end, I think it's just on the issue of the crisis, is that this issue of elongating, of prolonging, you know, crisis, that we think crisis is far distant ahead, simply because our debt and domestic, the government debt and relations with our debt is domestic. I think it's also causing problem because it creates perverse incentives in the public sector and in the private sector. When interest rates are high in the public sector, you're most likely to have all these banking institutions investing in government bond, and that's where crowding out happens. You don't have this is the feedback loops that Mamokete is talking about. You don't have investment in the real economy because you are making more returns in the public sector. And I think this, you know, this reconciliation of policy and budget, it really needs to happen at a budget process level. Again, that's where the reforms need to happen, so that when the Minister of Finance eventually presents his budget or her budget, it's an aggregation of, it is a reconciliation of policies that have been discussed between the private sector and all important stakeholders, which will be representative of the aspirations of the country. Thank you very much, Abba.
Thank you, Mashete. That's an incredibly quick, sharp response to that, to the issues. And thanks to all the colleagues that are here that joined us for this discussion. I'm just going to end up with a little plug for the book that many of you contributed to. It's available. You can go through on our website. It's at Exclusive Books, etc., etc. So please support MISTRA through donations and purchase of the books. But most importantly, support us by engaging in these discussions and roundtables that we have. So on behalf of the Mapungubwe Institute, thank you very much to Mashete, and thank you to all the panelists and the respondents, and obviously those that were present online, providing your very, very useful inputs. We hope to continue taking these discussions forward, and we'll certainly pull a discussion together post the budget speech next year. Look forward to seeing you. If not before that, see you then. All the best. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.